Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a realistic cat in graphite. Now this project here, it really does focus on how to draw that soft, ruffled up fur texture that cats typically have on their chest. Now before I get to that section of the portrait, I always like to start off with the eyes first. Now this is where the main emotion and expression stems from, so as you can see here I'm really starting to capture that already. Now a key part of drawing realistic eyes is the shading, and I've got a couple of videos here on YouTube that focus on top tips for drawing realistic cat eyes. I'll put one of those in the description below if it's of interest. So after this eye is done, I usually like to work on the fur that surrounds it. Now I like to work in small manageable chunks because I feel that as it starts to look like that reference photo early on, I'm far more motivated to keep on going. Now you can work in whole individual layers, so you can block in the base layer, then do your whole layer for the entire cat and so on. But I like to work in this way because I feel that I don't ever rush through very important stages. So if you do start to feel overwhelmed by the process, it's usually because we're focusing on too much of a larger area. Now as I continue to map in the darker markings here, it's very important to pay close attention to your reference photo. Markings like this, regardless if they're light or dark, they are very unique to the structure of the face. So if we start to change their position, even if it is just slightly, we can then alter the shape of that animal's face. So that is something to pay very close attention to at all times, but especially if you're taking on pet portrait commissions. If the markings are making the face not quite resemble the right shape, then it's not going to look like that pet as much as it should when the portrait's finished. Now sometimes you might be looking at your artwork and thinking, something's not quite right, but you're not quite sure what it is. It could just be that one of the main highlights and shadows is not quite in the right place, and it is making the animal look slightly different. So as long as you're making sure that you're placing those accurately, and that's why I like to make sure that I've done that at the base layer stage, so that there's less guessing involved later on, then I know that I'm more likely to follow that reference photo right from the beginning. It just makes the whole drawing process thereon after much easier. Now every time I start a new section, you'll see that first of all there is that mid-grey layer of graphite down first. Now what I'm doing there is I'm using graphite powder to basically just block in my main lights and darks. Now I'm not going to keep going back in with my graphite powder to make things as dark as what I can see in the reference photo. I'm doing that here as I build up with my graphite pencils. But I do like to have that graphite powder layer first of all because I feel that I'm then able to again more accurately follow that reference photo if those main lights and darks are mapped in first. Now I have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But one of the things I talk about there regarding pencil technique is the importance of fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Those three things are very important. It doesn't matter what the animal is, those three elements are going to make a massive difference to how realistic the fur looks. Now the fur direction, just like the position of the lights and the darks, it's not random. It follows that underlying bone and muscular structure. So any little alteration where it curves over, I like to try to make sure that I've captured that, even if it is with just one or two pencil strokes. Now again, this is something that I focus thoroughly in the in-depth real-time tutorials on Patreon. Because I'm recording these with a voiceover while I'm drawing, there are no sections sped up or cut out, and that enables me to cover all of these techniques thoroughly. If you are interested in this real-time tutorial or any of my others on Patreon, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. The wonderful thing with Patreon is it's completely flexible, so you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. Now onto the nose. When drawing cats, I feel that this is one of the more complex areas to get right, yet it's one of the smallest. I pay very close attention to the way that the nose is shaped. Just like when I map in the eyes, I always start off with a HB pencil first, just to map in those nostrils and that darker central line. Once I've got those in, I've got a really good idea of where exactly the main highlights should be around that, and then I start to automatically build up that realistic nose from there. But if I try to draw the nose all in one layer, I find that that ends up not looking realistic and it very easily can take on a different shape. Now because the nose of most animals is in the middle of their face, it's very distracting if it's wrong. So it's one of those things, just like with the eyes, I take that extra time to make sure that I've got that initial outline right. Now when it then comes to working on the fur around the nose, I want to pay very close attention to that pencil technique. the fur length here, so how short or how long our pencil strokes should be in this area, is significantly shorter than everywhere else on the face. So I really do have to be making sure that I'm adjusting the way that I'm using the pencil to capture each individual section of that fur. If we use the same pencil technique from start to finish, then the fur is going to look flat, it's not going to resemble that pet or potentially that animal at all. So we do want to be paying very close attention to each small section of that reference photo. Now, depending on the angle of the face, the fur on one side of the face might look shorter than the other. So that is again something to pay very close attention to. Just because the length of the fur on the left side of the muzzle area is shorter doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same length as the other side. You want to pay very close attention to that in your photo. Now, in some cases you might want to just draw little dots or more shading. It's all going to depend on the angle of the photo, the quality of that photo, the lighting. There are many different factors. Now again, this is something that I do focus on the real-time versions on Patreon. I've got a wide variety of dog, cat, animal tutorials there, and I've got a Patreon library on my website so that you can see all of the tutorials that are available before you sign up. That's also linked in the description below as well. Now, the next stage of this portrait was where I was starting to work on the chest fur. Now, when it came to working on this, I have to really break this reference photo up into manageable sections. Now, this is where I wanted my main focus, the priority of this lesson to be. I still made sure to cover loads of information on the face and of course as thoroughly as I could in the real-time tutorial, but the chest fur here, this is exactly what I wanted to cover in this tutorial. The complexity of where it ruffles up, how it groups together and moves. All of this can make us sit and stare at our reference photo and think, I have no idea where to start. Now that can be a normal feeling and it can get quite overwhelming. So in this tutorial on Patreon, I'll show how to work around those feelings and then progress through that portrait in a way that we are effective and efficient. This was really fun to draw. It was a beautiful reference photo to work from. And as I start to build up my layers here, this looks terrible, but eventually it starts to look like that reference photo. Now this is something that I've spoken about with lots of artists, how we can sometimes get very despondent early on because this doesn't look great, but it has to start somewhere. Now, I always say about trusting the process and making sure that it's just one layer at a time. We're not trying to make this look amazing from the first and second layer. That's just not possible. It's all about coming back with layers, refining those contrasts, adding in more details, using erasers to remove some of that graphite where needed. This is also why I like to work in those small sections, because this one part of the fur, it is quite complex to look at in that photo. If I try to draw too much of a larger area, it's going to make me sit there and look more confused at that reference photo. It's going to make me doubt that process even more. So this is another reason why I'm going to take it into potentially 1 or 2 square inches if I have to, and then break that up into those individual layers. Now, one thing that you'll find is once you've got the technique and you're then confident using that, the rest of that fur texture for the portrait becomes a little easier. So this area on the neck was probably one of the most complex sections, and once we'd got confident with how we should use the pencils, how we should layer the pencils, the blending techniques, the softening methods, all of this is then applied to this section of the portrait as well. So again, here I'm using my graphite powder to map in my main tones, and then I start to come back in with my graphite pencils and really refine those lights and the darks. This is what's going to make this fur look realistic. Now, I always speak about the importance of contrast and values in any of my tutorials regardless of the medium. And one question that I'm asked a lot for colour-based mediums is, how do we know what colours to select based on the reference photo that we're working from? Now, because I focus on the values, how light or how dark that colour should be, graphite is a wonderful medium at making the colour selection easier, because we're learning with graphite to just focus on the main tones, the main highlights and shadows. Now, if colour was the one thing that made a portrait realistic, then graphite wouldn't be able to be used for these kinds of portraits, but that's absolutely not the case. Graphite can create beautiful photorealistic and hyper-realistic work that looks like a black and white photograph, yet there's no colour involved, and that's because we're focusing on the values and contrast. As I'm continuing to use my erasers and going back in with my graphite pencils, altering my lights and my darks, the subject starts to take on more of a three-dimensional feel. So this is why I focus every single one of my tutorials, and I speak about it so often here on YouTube, about how I want to be paying very close attention to my highlights, my midtones and my shadows. Now regarding midtones, I feel this is an area that often gets forgotten about with many different mediums. I like to focus on the subtle midtones just as much as my highlights and shadows, and this is something that I cover thoroughly on Patreon. Being able to work with those midtones is what, in this case for this cat, is what's going to make that fur look soft. If I have really bright highlights but really dark shadows and no midtones in between, this fur is going to look very flat and two-dimensional because we don't have the softness there. The midtones are what provide a softness with this fur texture. Now noticing all of the midtones is definitely something that is easier to see in the slower real-time version, and we're able to really focus on the softness of the pencil, how much pressure to apply in order to get these range of midtones. I don't actually use many graphite pencils, only maybe 4 or 5 for this project, but by adjusting the pressure I'm able to get a range of values. Now of course you can use as many graphite pencils as you need to, but there are things to consider when working with really hard pencils, something like your 7, 8 and 9H. There you've got a potential of indenting your paper, so you have to be very careful with how much pressure you apply. And I want to be making sure as well that I don't just jump in using my soft dark pencils like a 9B first. I want to be building up all of those values gradually. This again goes back to those subtle layers and enables me to then get a range of values before I jump into those darker layers. Now one big tip, regardless of the medium that you're working in, is for the last section of that portrait, that very last half an hour or so, is we don't want to rush this process. If I start to rush here and skip layers and really start to make decisions that are not as good as they have been elsewhere, then it is going to bring down this section of the portrait. Then ultimately the whole portrait starts to also become affected. So it can be very distracting. I want to pay very close attention to the reference photo, making sure that this area of the portrait is just as realistic as the rest. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this or any of my other tutorials, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if this video was useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really grateful. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be uploading another video next week.